everyone. Welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Capello. Tonight, global market roller coaster on recession fears.
Canada cheats, Mexico cheats, just one of those things. But we are resetting a table and we're going to have great trade.
Massive market volatility around the world as international markets react to Trump's tariffs and the risk of further trade war escalation between the U.S. and China. What might it mean for the possibility of a recession and how this country's economy will be impacted? Find out with Stephen Polaz, John Manley, and Amanda Lang, who will all join me live in moments. Then, recession speculation hits the campaign trail.
Yes, the probability of a recession in the United States has gone up significantly.
We are all watching the stock market with interest today.
We have found throughout history that you don't cut your way out of a recession.
Do Canada's major party leaders think a recession is coming, and how might they handle it? If so, we're going to take you on the campaign trail with our traveling reporters ahead. Plus, Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith hits back at federal Liberal leader Mark Carney's comments.
We're sending Doug Ford on to Fox News. And we're going to send Danielle next. Maybe we won't send Danielle. No.
Well, I've noticed this with progressive men, how much they talk about how much they support women until they meet a strong conservative woman.
We're going to talk to our front bench about that ahead of a conservative rally and guest appearance by former Prime Minister Stephen Harper in Edmonton. That conversation is coming up in just a bit on our program. First, though.
No other president would be willing to do what I'm doing or to even go through it. Now, I don't mind going through it because I see a beautiful picture at the end. But we are making tremendous progress with a lot of countries, and the countries that really took advantage of us are now saying, please negotiate. You know why? Because they're getting beaten badly because of what's happening. They're getting beaten badly. They're being devalued as countries. But it's the only chance we're going to have to reset the table on trade.
U.S. President Donald Trump firmly there standing by his global tariff trade war, despite a third day of international market chaos with the fear of a worldwide recession deepening. The Dow Jones, for example, dropped 349 points, the TSX 334 points, the S&P 500 closing a lot higher than it opened, but still down about 12 points. Japan's primary index fell 6.5%, Hong Kong's 13.2%, its worst day since 1997. The Pan-European Stock 600 closed the day down 4.5%. In Germany's DAX lost 4.26%. Here's some international political temperature taking.
This is a moment for cool heads. Nobody wins from a trade war, but it's also a moment for urgency.
This introduces a lot of uncertainty, lack of predictability, inflation fears.
Even the basis of the calculation is nonsense. Yes, the assumption that a trade budget surplus or deficit is a problem in itself is a wrong estimation.
Everything we do in the days ahead has to be to create the environment that brings the U.S. administration to the table. And I think there are many, many reasons, not just here, but in the global markets that are going to make that an inevitability.
You can hear it there in the aggregate. This is all stoking fears of a recession, even here in Canada, plus, of course, around the world. We've brought together an all-star panel on the economy to discuss that. Former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Polaz is here. He's a special advisor at Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt. Former Finance Minister John Manley is with us. He's the chair of Jefferies Financial Canada and chair of the TELUS Corp Board. And the host of Taking Stock on BNN Bloomberg rounds us out. Amanda Lang is with us as well. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for making the time for the conversation tonight. Amanda, I'll start with you on the day's ups and downs, because there were moments in the morning that you saw a tiny rally on the possibility of a reprieve of these tariffs, and then a ton of, a very punctuated nosedive, you can say. But then the end of the day, didn't finish essentially as badly as it had looked to be starting. What is your read on where things stand in the markets at this moment?
Yeah, Vashi, if you didn't know what was going on, if you hadn't seen the markets last week, this was a nothing day other than the wild swings internally. Where it ended the day could have been any day. The difference, of course, is investors are trying to price in a bunch of unknowns. I think what I suspect is happening here is they've priced in what they can so far. We have a few wild weeks ahead of us because we're going to be hearing from companies as they deliver their earnings. We'll get some more specifics from them on what they see ahead. And we might get some news out of China, the EU, the US on what might happen on tariffs. All new information, every piece of it will go into these markets.
Stephen, is it the uncertainty that the markets are trying to price in? And is that even possible? Or is it the tariffs themselves and the use of them as a tool in the way that President Trump is trying to use them?
Well, there's no question. There's still lots of uncertainty. I wouldn't claim that we already know what we're doing. But the fact is that we have learned enough in the last few days to treat this shock seriously. Mr. Trump has done something that will reduce everybody's income, everyone in the world, by an unknown amount, let's say, and for an unknown length of time. But it will also, if we treat it seriously, will reduce growth in the future. So imagine every one of those bits of income come from a company somewhere. And today, markets are trying to price the value of those companies based on this lower income that they'll be able to deliver and lower growth into the future. A very hard thing to do. But there's no question it's really big, and it's all down. And it's down everywhere. And that's why the stock market is trying to find a new place to go. A bit of certainty right about now would help, but it would still be certainly down.
John, do you think, I mean, even on the prospect of certainty, you had, for example, Donald Trump in the White House just last hour saying, you know, they're going to stay, but I'm open to negotiations. Like, is there, even if he says I'm going to do X, Y, and Z today, is there a way to build certainty into that when he is as unpredictable as he is? And not basing this, I should say, on anything you hear from any economist that says, oh, yes, this historical argument you're making about tariffs makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's the fundamental problem that the world is facing today, that he's got some kind of voodoo economics that he believes. But on top of that, he has been unreliable, and he has made his country a very unreliable partner. We've seen that, you know, close at hand in Canada and Mexico. We negotiated with him, with his administration, resolving the USMCA in 2020, and his first day in office, he breached it. And so, how do you go and make a deal with somebody who cannot be trusted, who cannot be believed, who is unreliable, and goes, as we just saw in the clip you played, goes on international television and lies. Canada doesn't cheat. If anyone doesn't cheat, it's the Boy Scout Canadians. The U.S. is cheating by ignoring their agreement.
Yeah, he seems to have a completely different understanding of the word cheat as well. Amanda, I wanted to ask you about sort of moving forward beyond the uncertainty we just discussed. What other indicators will be key for the markets and that you'll be watching for example, China and this back and forth around the possibility of counter tariffs and then other tariffs that you know, Donald Trump is essentially saying he's going to tariff them as of Wednesday above 100%. I know there are a number of speeches by some key Federal Reserve officials expected, and even economic indicators like consumer price data as well. In combination, what are you looking at?
I mean, all of that, of course, but the two categories will be big news on tariffs. So will there be any shift towards negotiations? Will you see the U.S. backing off some more benign players like the EU and Canada and focusing on China, which is probably where its attention could be well spent? And then the second category is, what are businesses saying? In real time, what are we hearing about shipments that aren't happening, business that's slowing down, prices they have to pass on? We just got a survey from the Bank of Canada businesses that tells us that our Canadian businesses are planning to pass prices on. So the inflationary impacts will be real. And that, of course, will create a conundrum for our policymakers, especially our central bank, about what to do with inflation in a time of slowing growth.
I wonder if on a broader level as well, I feel like Canadians are watching all this, Stephen, and sort of feeling helpless in a way, right? Like this external factor that is so unpredictable that you would never have anticipated would self-inflict this kind of damage on the worldwide economy is doing so. There is a very live conversation about how we mitigate against all of that. But if you were to highlight some of the things policymakers should be looking at, what would they be?
Well, bear in mind that this action will destroy our income levels, you know, to some degree, as we were talking before. You can't fix that just by having some, you know, government policy that replaces people's incomes. You can't lower interest rates and hope that would somehow fix things up. None of those things are true. These are structural effects on the economy and therefore on our companies. So what needs to happen is that we need to think about, well, what can we do that's in effect brand new? What can we do to help companies pivot to something that's brand new with a growth trajectory? What kind of things can we do to make it easier for those things to happen? Are the things that are making it hard today, which we could talk for the whole segment about those. So let's get rid of some of those things so that we can make it easier. So all those things are on the table. The candidates are talking about them. It's great to see. That needs, of course, translate into action quite rapidly to create a band of certainty for companies moving forward.
I want to follow up with you for just a second and ask, you've seen economies around the world, and in this one in particular, through many different crises. Is this a crisis? Do you think that we are on the heels of one?
Well, I think in all senses of the word, yes. I mean, we were talking about probably the greatest intentional destruction of wealth ever. Maybe that's the kind of headline that the president's gearing towards. And that just means there's a major setback. And so it could even have financial crisis-like symptoms if it goes much further and rapidly, as we were discussing at the intro. So all to say that we should at least be treating it as one. It is a crisis in the sense that going forward from here requires brand new thinking, brand new pivots, brand new initiatives to build up what we're losing in the process.
Do you anticipate, John, as again, a finance minister who lived through a lot of ups and downs, that this will consume whomever forms the next government?
Oh, absolutely, for some of the reasons that Stephen mentions, and because this has turned our entire economic strategy since 1989 on its head. Since then, since the implementation of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, we have tried to build those north-south corridors in every sector, in energy, in automotive, in steel and aluminum. All of the things that we make and that are consumed in vast numbers by the United States have flowed north-south. We've now got to turn that on its head. I went around the world as industry minister and as finance minister, and my investment thesis for Canada was always, look, we've got a country that's rich in natural resources. We've got lots of human talent. We've got world-leading innovation and technology. We've got institutions, rule of law, and we've got unfettered access to the United States market. Well, we've got all of those except for the last one, and that's a big one, which means we've got to turn out a different investment thesis. We're going to have to say Canada's a low-cost country in which to do business. We've got to attract investment into this country. We've got to accelerate the time it takes us to get some of our major projects built. We've got to build energy self-sufficiency. We're exporters of energy, but we're also importers of energy. We've got to worry about the security of our data. There's a whole list of things that the next government on the 29th of April is going to have to turn their minds to, and it's big work, and some of it's going to be force them to make unpopular decisions. They're not going to have a ton of money to dispense around because government revenues are going to fall as personal incomes and corporate incomes fall, and that's going to create pressure on our deficit. There's a mess that people are campaigning to be responsible for handling on the 29th of April, trust me.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. Thanks, everyone, for the discussion. I appreciate the analysis this evening. Stephen Polas, John Manley, and Amanda Lang. All the leaders on the campaign trail, understandably, as you just heard, focused on how they'd handle this. Have a listen.
What you need to do in a crisis, and I've long experienced in this, is you need to meet it with overwhelming force.
We know that seniors should not pay the price for Donald Trump's economic vandalism.
What we need to do, because we also are up against a housing crisis, is to build in our country. We need to build up a stronger economy.
And we'll get more details on those plans from our reporters covering each of the campaigns after a very short break. Stay right there. More powerful.
We can't control the United States. We can control what we do here in this country. And that's why we're being clear about, and we've been clear from the start, in terms of the huge payback if we have one Canadian economy, not 13.
We are all watching the stock market with interest today. We have to acknowledge that this chaos is the direct result of wrong-headed, unnecessary, chaotic policies coming from President Trump.
We have found throughout history that you don't cut your way out of a recession. That just makes the pain even worse. What you have to do is invest in people. And with the uncertainty in the States and how that's impacting workers in Canada, we actually need to invest in our country.
Campaign week 3 kicking off with leaders. As you heard, they're responding to the Donald Trump trade war that went global last week as markets panicked today. Leaders are now forced to work responses into their campaign platforms. We've got our traveling reporters out on the trail with details on how these leaders are saying that they would steer Canada through the crisis. We'll begin with Jeremy Charron in Delta, British Columbia. He is following the Conservative campaign for us right now. Jeremy, what is the leader of that party, Pierre Poilievre, saying about the prospect of a recession and how he might respond to it?
Yeah, Vashi, Pierre Poilievre addressed the volatility in the stock market today as chaotic, as you just heard. He said something that's a direct result of Donald Trump's policies, which he also called chaotic. When it comes to a response, he spent this morning in northern British Columbia, where he addressed the energy sector and what he called the next phase of his economic plan, a plan that he says would help Canada become less self-reliant and certainly less reliant on the United States. Specifically, he promised to push forward 10 big energy projects and to ensure a much shorter approval process when it comes to big projects. We also heard from Pierre Poilievre today that he is looking to specifically address seniors and their concerns in the face of this economic crisis, allowing them, he promises, to keep their money in their RSPs for an extra 2 years. He's also focused on in the past. He referenced today his next phase of that economic plan, but he's talked about in the past incentivizing and promoting investment in Canada. TFSAs, he's offered up that Canadians could put $5,000 more in their TFSAs as long as that money is reinvested again in the Canadian economy. And he's also promised that his government would allow for a capital gains deferral again, as long as that money is being reinvested in the Canadian economy. So the Conservative Party is certainly pushing for Canadians to reinvest here at home and to try and incentivize even industry and investors to spend their money here and pull it out of external markets. So that is how he is planning so far to address this crisis.
Okay, thanks so much, Jeremy. Jeremy Charron following the Conservative campaign for us. Let's turn to the liberal campaign. CTV's Abigail Beeman is with us from Victoria, where Carney was answering the same, Mark Carney rather, was answering the same question.
Vashi, Mark Carney was very clear about the United States. He says the U.S. is driving itself into a recession. But when asked whether he believes Canada is headed in the same direction, he wasn't as clear. He said an American recession will have, quote, significant effects on the Canadian economy. Carney said his main message to Canadians is we can give ourselves far more than the U.S. can take away. In terms of what can actually be done about it, the Liberal leader said if elected, one of the first orders of business will be meeting his promise to drop all interprovincial trade barriers by Canada Day. He also pointed to commitments that came out of his last meeting with all the premiers before the campaign started, changes made to employment insurance and providing more liquidity to Canadian businesses. Speaking here on Vancouver Island, Carney said he has spoken with both the finance minister and the governor of the Bank of Canada today, and he has confidence they're on top of things. And we're pointing out from the campaign side of things, today's announcements about protecting nature and helping seniors worried about their savings in the face of volatility were made right in Green Party co-leader Elizabeth May's riding, one the Liberals are now targeting. Vashi?
All right, that's Abigail Beeman for us in British Columbia, also following the Liberal campaign. Over to the NDP. Our senior political correspondent, Mike LeCouture, is following that campaign. Mike, how is Jagmeet Singh responding to the prospect of a recession?
Well, actually, Jagmeet Singh says the threat of a recession is real, and he says many Canadians are concerned about it, and so is his party. But he says historically, governments can't cut their way out of it because in the past, that has only made things worse. Singh says the solution is to invest in people and invest in services for those people. It's why his campaign was focusing on those two things, even as the uncertainty from the U.S. continues to reverberate on this side of the border. Today, Singh announced more money to build affordable housing. He says it'll help create jobs in Canada and fight back against inflation. Now, Singh announced today an NDP government would double the current pace of home construction in this country, aiming to build 3 million new homes by the year 2030. The NDP plan would replace the current Housing Accelerator Fund with a $16 billion fund for provinces and municipalities to focus on affordable homes. Singh says they would not make the investment unless there was a guarantee that the new homes would be affordable. To pay for the promise and avoid it from being inflationary spending, Singh has proposed to end offshore tax havens, which he says could bring in $30 billion a year. He also mentioned the idea of victory bonds again as a way for Canadians to invest in this country. Now, Singh is taking that affordability message west once again. He is heading to BC, an important battleground for all parties, but especially his, since the NDP caucus has half of its seats in that province. Vashi?
All right, thanks, Mike. That's Mike LeCouture reporting on the NDP campaign this evening. Some additional news out of Ottawa tonight. The government task force set up to monitor Canada's election for foreign interference says it has uncovered an operation trying to shape opinion on Liberal leader Mark Carney, saying posts from a Chinese government-linked news account, Yuli Yumian, on the social media platform WeChat has been posting positive reports on Carney. The task force says it observed large spikes of, quote, coordinated inauthentic behavior preceding the election campaign and then again during the campaign on March 25th. The Liberal Party was briefed, according to the task force yesterday, and the task force determined, quote, this activity ultimately is not affecting Canada's ability to have a free and fair election. I'm going to take a quick commercial break. On the other end of that break, I'm back with the front bench, Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Carl Bélanger, and Laura Stone. Lots to unpack at the start of week 3 of this federal election campaign. Back with them. There they are in just a moment.
I terminated NAFTA. Everybody said it would be impossible. And I terminated through Congress. We terminated it. You had to get it through Congress. It was a trap. It was a horrible thing, and we got it done. And we went to the USMCA, which was much better. The problem is they cheat. They cheat like crazy. Canada cheats, Mexico cheats, just one of those things. But we are resetting a table, and we're going to have great trade.
As you can hear there, Donald Trump's global trade war has not taken the heat off Canada, with the president still signaling us out, even as global markets went on a roller coaster ride today and late last week. Here's a taste of how that market roller coaster hit the campaign trail today.
Yes, the probability of a recession in the United States has gone up significantly. My government will act with force. We will accelerate major investments. We will provide very clear guidelines on where we're going to spend money.
Mark Carney will be trotting out his trophy titles and the inflated hype around his false resume claims on this day.
There are real concerns that we might find ourselves in a position where we're up against a lot of difficulty. We have found throughout history that you don't cut your way out of a recession.
Let's unpack what you just heard with our front bench. Former senior advisor to the Liberal Ontario governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, Dan Moulton is here. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. Shakir Chambers is a vice president at Oyster Group. He worked in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office before becoming a policy advisor to the International Trade Minister. Former interim NDP National Director Carl Bélanger is with us. He's now the president of Traction Strategies. And Laura Stone rounds us out. She's a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. The conversation around Trump, I'll start with you, Shakir, has largely been to the Liberals' advantage so far. We've talked at length on this panel and others about how they were able to close the gap when Justin Trudeau left and then Trump kind of started making his very direct threats. How do you think that is, as we hit into the midpoint of this, or we look ahead in the next few days to the midpoint of this campaign, do you think it's still status quo, or if the Conservatives are trying to punch through with a different message, what is it?
So I think the Conservatives are sticking to that message around affordability, around change. But it's hard to get that message to break through, right? Especially on a day like today. You're seeing PR coming out and now trying to attack Mark Carney's credibility. But when the global economy is literally crumbling around you during a federal campaign, it's really hard to punch through with that message. And I feel the tough thing for Pierre is that we're, in week 3 now? Over the past 2 weeks, at least 50 to 60% of the campaign, you've had to respond to what Trump has said or respond to a policy that he's kind of put in the window. And if you're doing that, it's hard to drive forward on the affordability piece. It's hard to drive forward on resource development. And so it automatically puts Pierre Poilievre on his back foot. I think he's doing a pretty good job driving the affordability piece home. But I think what we're looking at now is we always talk about the ballot box question. I've been looking at some data from Abacus over the weekend, and they're saying that boomers are the ones who really care about Donald Trump and, what he's going to do to the economy. And you have younger Canadians like myself who really care more about the affordability stuff, about housing and whatnot. So we have to see who really drives home that message. And ultimately, when we get to E-Day, who really pulls out that vote to get their voter to the ballot box to cast that ballot on the issues they care about.
Even today, though, you had both parties, Dan, in the Conservatives and the Liberals, essentially augment part of their campaign announcements to address the market instability, and they were geared at seniors, right? Not younger generations, because they don't have as much panic, because they can keep their money where it is, or even invest in a lower performing market. But people who are ready for retirement or retired are super nervous, and therefore the announcements today ended up being geared in that direction. Not all of them, but they had to augment the plan.
Yeah, I think the Liberal campaign has been successful over the last several weeks in projecting an image of professionalism and stability, right? It's what Canadians are looking for right now from their government, is a sense of comfort and calm and someone to sort of lead through this turbulence. The market turmoil we're seeing today is just adding more wind to the Liberal sails in that regard. It plays very strongly into Mark Carney's hands in terms of the kind of leader he wants to present himself as in this election. And it seems, based on the public opinion data, that that's what Canadians are looking for from their leaders right now. So I think this is to his advantage. They are firmly entering this third week as the front runners in this campaign. I think their announcement today was evidence of that. They are going to continue to play from a position of strength and safety. What's confusing me is why Pierre Poilievre isn't adjusting his approach, right? I think I understand Shakir's point in terms of the affordability messages playing into a core committed voter set of his who are young and male and worried about their ability to buy a house or the affordability and are looking for change in Ottawa. But the reality is that clearly isn't shaking up the campaign in a way that is going to drive a different dynamic in key parts of the country like Ontario, where the Liberals are leading by a significant margin. I know nationally we see a Liberal lead, of somewhere in the range to, a few points to wider spreads of 5 to 10 points. But in Ontario, that spread is more than 10 points, right? Most polls are now consistently showing the Liberals well ahead in the province of Ontario, well ahead the province of Quebec. And so it's surprising to me that Poilievre isn't trying to shift his tactics a little bit here to speak to a different demographic of voters than he spent the last 2 weeks talking to.
I think there's an attempt, Carl, and I'll explain, but I just, the question is whether it actually works. And I wonder what kind of runway they have. I think that they're trying to essentially not abandon the people who want change, because that's their core constituency and always has been, but sort of say, well, if this is permanent and there is sort of a permanent restructuring of our trade relationship, our economy, then, you can trust us more because we're not kind of the record holders for the last 10 years. I'm not saying that's working, but I think that's the pitch that they're trying to make. Do you think they have time to make that pitch, or is the runway kind of closing in on that, Carl?
Well, I think it's because the narrative or the appetite for change has disappeared in this campaign. I think Mark Carney captured some of that, and it's not one of the main feelings of the electorate right now. The main feelings are fear and anger. So those who are fearful, I agree with Dan, they're going to Mark Carney's Liberals because he projects an image of confidence in the turbulent times that we have. And they're, relying a little bit on that to get support from other voters, especially from the pool coming from the NDP and the Bloc Québécois. So that fear factor certainly is putting the campaign on its head. What I heard from Pierre Poilievre, though, is that he's still relying a lot on anger. And I'm not sure that's working, certainly not to attract new voters. So the pivot that he's doing right now, trying to, propose measures on affordability, It comes with a tone. It's a tone that Canadians are not quite buying at this time. Similarly for Jagmeet Singh, who's making also promises on affordability and trying to help people. He's trying to sell hope. That's also not selling on the market today, at least in terms of voters.
To put it mildly, I guess, in a market context. Laura, I wanted to ask you about the NDP as well, because they've almost, I would say, in some respects, they've pivoted in that they go to Windsor when there's a big, they're talking about workers, certainly, but they're also like I would argue in some instances, more focused from a policy perspective on healthcare, climate change, like the things you would have expected in an election 4 years ago, for example. What do you think is informing that? And do you think that has any chance in the next 3 weeks of resonating beyond what we have seen as a pretty precipitous drop in their public opinion polling numbers?
Well, I mean, at this point, it sort of seems like they're trying to save the furniture, right? And talk to those much more progressive voters who they've relied on in the past, who may not be part of Team Carney at this stage, who might view, the Liberal Party shift somewhat to the center as unpalatable to them. And, I think it's been noticed by others in the media that Mr. Singh has changed his tone somewhat from running for prime minister to elect us to hold the government to account, or elect more NDP members to push for the issues that you care about, from pharmacare to dental care. They kind of talk about fighting the battles of the past. So it is kind of the melody, a bit of a protest party, or a party kind of grasping for straws at the end. I don't want to seem sound too dire, but that's sort of, they kind of have to give up on the dream a little bit and be more realistic as to what their position can be at this stage. So maybe that's where they see the space for them, right? They can't run as a centrist party. They have to very much lean into their left-leaning bona fides. And so that's where the push is now. And the message will potentially shift even more so to them being the party that holds the government, the Liberal government, to account, that pushes for more services for people, that's going to be viewed more as the voice of the progressives within a Liberal government if they're able to keep the Liberals to a minority.
Do you think, Shakir, even that message, though, will resonate when people are so sharply focused on what the next government will do?
Yeah, I think it's really tough for the NDP. I think when people are looking at who's going to be able, if the ballot box question is taking on Donald Trump, I'm not sure the NDP have a lot to say in this conversation. That's where you see the numbers where they are right now. I think when I look at someone like Pierre Poilievre, again, as I said earlier, he's trying to erode a little bit of the credibility in Mark Carney as terms of being this guy who could take on Donald Trump. As he has a natural advantage when there's tariffs. Mark Carney's in front of a podium, announcing a response. He's gathering the premiers. He's talking to foreign leaders. So there's just this natural image of him being very prime ministerial. But I think Pierre is asking the question, like, why are we just giving this guy this kind of position of, being able to negotiate with Donald Trump? Why are we just anointing him as the best person to negotiate with Donald Trump? I understand his resume, but a lot of folks look at Mark Carney. I'm not even sure they really know his resume. They see fancy titles, they see high-profile titles, and just make this assumption he's the best guy to negotiate with Donald Trump. And I think what's happening right now is Pierre is trying to erode that trust in him, erode that credibility in him, and say, don't just anoint this guy as this person to have this role. There are other things to consider. And I think even look at some of the Q&As that Mark Carney's having out there. They're asking him questions about his positions, like, how are you going to, commit to an emissions cap, or how are you going to commit to bringing emissions down, but you want to fast-track resource development? And he doesn't really have good answers. He gives you a bunch of these word salads, and I think holding him to account on more issues like that, I think a lot of folks have to ask themselves the question, does this guy really, really, truly know what he's doing? Is he really ready to be in this position? I think that's a narrative the Conservatives will continue to push forward to the rest of this campaign.
And Dan, I'll give you the last word just really quickly, because I understand the political imperative there very much so. In a regular election, again, I feel like those, that the questions that they're raising and even the negative tone they take on would be almost expected and would, again, be the political imperative makes sense. The problem is delivering it with, as Carl pointed out, the tone with which it's being delivered also poses a challenge for the Conservatives at this moment in time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to pick up on some of Shakir's comments there, I mean, you look at the public opinion data, and I think that one of the most compelling items that's consistent across all the polls isn't just vote intention, it's preferred prime minister. It's who's best to deal with Donald Trump. In both of those categories, Mark Carney's now way ahead of Pierre Poilievre. And so, Shakir, like it or not, the public has clearly coalesced around this idea. And having seen focus groups for older voters, in particular older women voters, I mean, the thing that they are gravitating towards is his resume, is his experiences. And you hear consistently in those groups, Mark Carney has a significant resume, is ready for this moment, and Pierre Poilievre has never had another job. And I think that's whether or not that's fair, it's resonated with Canadians. It's ingrained in people's minds at this point that one of these guys has a significant resume that's really well tailored to this moment, and one of them's really angry and has never had a job outside of Parliament.
Okay, lots more for us to discuss after a short commercial break. We're back with the front bench after that.
We're sending Doug Ford onto Fox News to show them that we're not messing around up here. And we're going to send Danielle next. Maybe we won't send her. We won't send Danielle. No, maybe we won't. We won't send Danielle. No, that's a bad idea. Forget. Strike that. Strike that. Just ignore that back there.
Liberal leader Mark Carney at a rally over the weekend talking about premiers appearing on Fox News to advocate for cross-border diplomacy. He said He says it would be a bad idea, quote unquote, to put Alberta Premier Danielle Smith on the network. Ontario Premier Doug Ford brushed off the comments this morning, saying Carney was just joking around. But Smith took or had a different response.
Well, I've noticed this with progressive men, how much they talk about how much they support women until they meet a strong conservative woman. And the attitude is sit down and shut up. Well, I don't shut up. I make sure that Albertans know exactly how I feel about issues.
The front bench is back to talk about that. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Carl Belanger, and Laura Stone. Laura, you are in Alberta right now. I know you're covering a bunch of stuff, including you're at that press conference where the premier made those comments. How is this going over there?
It didn't go over too well with Danielle Smith, as you could see from the clip. She was all too happy, I think, to answer that question. Look, I would characterize it as a bit of a loose moment for Mr. Carney. I think it's almost like he forgot the cameras were rolling and he was just joking with his friends. And I think it does kind of hurt perhaps the statesman-like position that he holds himself in, and talking about uniting Canada. Whether this is going to have some great effect on the campaign, probably not. But I think, it does showcase how there is no love lost between Danielle Smith and Mark Carney, particularly on Danielle Smith's side. She talks at length about the feeling of Western alienation, Albertans feeling like they haven't been listened to for the past decade, and the concerns in this province about whether, what would happen if the Liberals form a government again. I think kind of what's most interesting here, and we talked about it at the press conference too, was the distance that she's taking between her past comments about Pierre Poilievre being in sync with the Trump administration. She made those on Breitbart News. She's now totally distancing herself from those comments, saying that that's up to Mr. Poilievre to comment on, which doesn't really make any sense because she's the ones that has said it. And she's trying to take herself out of the equation now. And I think there's probably some realization, to put it mildly, among conservative circles that has not helped Mr. Poilievre's cause when this election has become so much about Trump and who is best placed to take him on. And Mr. Poilievre tried to position himself as the firm defender of Canada in the face of these threats. So I think that kind of dynamic shift was kind of the most significant change coming out of Ms. Smith's press conference today.
What do you make of that shift? And I should point out that there's a conservative rally, and these rallies have been, Carl, very well attended, outside of the base of their support, outside of Alberta. I can only imagine tonight it'll also be headlined or special guest appearance by former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Your thoughts on Premier Smith kind of creating that distance at this moment in time?
Well, it's too late. The damage has been done. I mean, going down to Florida, talking about how we need to elect more Trump allies into Canada in reference to the Conservative Party of Pierre Poilievre. That's those things that, the Premier said that helped Mark Carney and the Liberals. She is Pierre Poilievre's worst enemy in this situation. And, maybe distancing herself right now won't have the impact that she hopes it will have. And in fact, the threats to national unity that we've seen in the past few days and the remarks that she's made and other, like Preston Manning, that also reinforced the feeling that, yeah, we need to vote for the Liberals because these guys are not going to be good for us. They're not going to be good for the country. We are afraid of them. And so you just feed that narrative over and over again. Contrast that with Doug Ford, who's, just working as well as Premier Smith for his constituents, but he's not immersing himself in the federal campaign. I think that was a better reaction, and it would have no impact on this case.
Although, to be fair, Doug Ford's constituents are very different than Danielle Smith's, right? The population, Shakir, in Ontario is much more open to voting Liberal by and large, and that could, I don't know what's going to happen in 3 weeks, but historically, much more so than in Alberta.
Yeah, and you're seeing what happens in Ontario. They got so much support for the EV industry to get those plans to the province. I think you have to understand in Alberta, they do feel very disrespected by not allowing to build their resource and get the resource to market, and you have to appreciate that, right? Even when you're talking about someone like Mark Carney, like I said in the last segment, talking about emissions caps, Smith has been pretty clear that, that's kind of a non-starter in these conversations. Bill C-69, she's been pretty clear that she doesn't want that legislation in place. So I can understand why Alberta feels disrespected. And I think even just having a comment like this, at the end of the day, Mark Carney is a sitting prime minister. It's pretty unbecoming for a prime minister to behave that way towards another premier, right? It kind of just erodes this notion of, this guy's just this sober, serious kind of statesman. You remove the script from him and he can just be easily as nasty and as divisive as his predecessor. So I think this portrayal of Carney, kind of being above partisan politics is just not true.
It is interesting, Dan, and I'd love your thoughts on it, because I think, for so long we're used to a world in which it was to Justin Trudeau's political advantage to be at odds with Danielle Smith or Jason Kenney, at the time, or conversely, it's in their political interest to be at odds with the prime minister when it was a Liberal prime minister, and both kind of took advantage of it. Do you think that Canadians are analyzing it differently, through a different lens right now, because this moment feels like above politics in a way?
Well, I think that has the potential to be true. I'm not sure in this case it will have that impact on a part of the electorate that's going to make a deciding impact on election day. I'll say two things about this. One, a lot of conservatives were sharing this clip last night and online and had similar perspectives to the one Shakir introduced here. The biggest knock on Mark Carney throughout this campaign, that he's too scripted, too wooden. He's not really going to be good at the the hustings and out there. I actually saw this clip and thought, oh, he sounds like a normal guy. Like, he sounds like a normal person, right? Which I think a lot of voters would react to the way he was joking about it in that way, in the same way Doug Ford did today. And by the way, I thought his comments about Doug Ford were complimentary, not negative. That was my takeaway on it when I first saw it. But the second thing is, to your point, Vashti, I think like in the parts of the country where Liberals need to perform well, in Ontario, in Quebec, and even, frankly, even in British Columbia, I think this plays pretty well to a lot of voters that are important to the Liberals. And I don't think that they're big fans of Danielle Smith. And the reality is, this is her third or fourth incursion into this campaign. And every time she stumbles in, she makes it a worse day for Pierre Poilievre. And I don't think we've seen the last of it. I think this will continue to happen to him throughout the campaign, where, she'll make him, I think, look a little small, given the perch she's on as a premier when she enters this campaign. But she also knocks him off his message in places where he needs to gain new voters. He's already got all the voters in Alberta. He's got to find new ones in other parts of the country, and she's making that job a lot harder for him every time she stumbles in. And I think the Liberals will work to keep this in the media cycle in the days ahead.
Well, certainly, Laura, they're definitely, like, you see that the media avails. Mr. Poilievre is consistently on the receiving end of questions. Hey, what do you think about what Preston Manning said? Is that going to happen? He has to say, he says no, for sure. Like, he responds in a way that would appeal to voters outside of Alberta. But just the very fact that he has to be answering those questions, I imagine, speaks to what Dan is outlining.
Yeah, and he's asked constantly why he's so much like Trump, and I'm sure that's extremely frustrating for him and the Conservative team when they have been pushing this message throughout the campaign of, we need to stand up for Canada, we need to make ourselves a stronger country and diversify. We've heard from Conservative strategists like Corey Tenike, who's on the show, that Mr. Poilievre did not do that early enough in the campaign, that even his slogans have been too similar to Mr. Trump, and whether that's conscious or not, even in this press conference today, I think Mr. Poilievre was talking about building big, beautiful projects, and you could almost see like the liberal attack ad creating itself out of that. So there is a perception, whether it's fair or not, and I'm sure a lot of conservatives would argue this is not fair. Poilievre has been pushing for Canada to be a stronger nation for throughout the last few years under the Trudeau government, and now because of his tone and his manner and how he has presented in the past, how he's treated the media, they're now having to face these constant comparisons. And so I think it is a difficult challenge for him. I think he is trying to fight it, and I think he is trying to come out as stronger out of the gate, unprompted, talking about Donald Trump and the chaos he's created, as he did today, trying to take a stronger stance to try to nip those comparisons in the bud with 3 weeks left to go in this campaign, and to really put that to rest and to bed.
Okay, I got to nip this in the bud for a commercial, so I'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Our wonderful front bench, Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Carl Belanger, and Laura Stone. We're back in just a moment. Welcome back to Power Play. Our takeaway today is all about Donald Trump's tariffs, the so-called reciprocal tariffs, and the market volatility that has arisen as a consequence. I asked former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz if we are headed for an economic crisis. Here's what he said.
In all senses of the word, yes. I mean, we're talking about probably the greatest intentional destruction of wealth ever. It is a crisis in the sense that going forward from here requires brand new thinking, brand new pivots, brand new initiatives to build up what we're losing in the process.
A reminder that Canada was spared from those so-called reciprocal tariffs, but a tariff, a 25% tax on all foreign-made cars, did go into effect last week, and we have already begun to see the consequences of that. A lot of talk on the campaign trail about how to respond to Trump as well. We'll have more coverage of that just ahead. I'll leave our program, Power Play, there. I'm Vashi Kapelis. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.